Hello, everyone. Welcome to Luohan webinar. Today, we are very happy to have Professor Joel Wattfogel. Joel is a professor of strategic management and entrepreneurship at the University of Minnesota, Carlson School of Management. His main research interests are industrialization, and he has conducted empirical studies of pricing, advertising, media markets, and operation of differentiated product markets, and especially issues related to digital products such as online publishing and music. He has published more than 50 articles in leading peer-reviewed journals, including the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, and the Rand Journal of Economics. He has also published several interesting books, including The Tyranny of the Market and Scrooge Economics, Why You Shouldn't Buy Presents for the Holidays, and Digital Renaissance. In there, he shows that digital technology is enabling a new golden age of popular culture. Today, he's going to talk about his new paper called Countervailing Platform Power, Spotify, and the Major Record Labels. Professor Wattfogel, the floor is yours. So we have 1 hour.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's fun to talk about this thing. This paper is new. It's joint with Luis, who's on the call, as well as a grad student named Axel at ETH. And it's different for me. I mean, I'm an economist, but I realize I've been in business schools now for 25 years. And so I thought, in honor of the 25th anniversary, I should start writing some papers that are more like business school papers. And so this one has that, although you'll see we haven't forgotten our economics roots, at least at some point after we discuss the results. So it's new stuff. We're happy to get comments, really, excited to talk about it. All right, and if there's time, I'm hoping to also show some bonus new facts and results about related issues at Amazon and its relationship with book publishers. Okay, so just background here. Digitization and distribution platforms. A bunch of industries like music and movies have traditionally been dominated by a small numbers of upstream suppliers. In music, we're down to a big 3 record labels or 3 major record labels, owners of multiple sub-labels. In books, there are essentially 5 of the so-called big 5 publishers who account for a big share of books. And prior to digitization, these suppliers had an enormous amount of control over what got produced, what got promoted, what got distributed. Downstream from them were really fragmented distribution systems. In music in the US and elsewhere in the world as well, fragmented ownership of radio stations and record stores, nobody with much power. It's sort of quaint to think back to 25 years ago in the US when people were wringing their hands with dismay. Oh my gosh, Walmart has like 10% of the retail market. That's an enormous amount of power. I mean, that's laughably trivial compared to the way the world is now. Anyway, so little say downstream over sort of supply choices. Now, digitization has really transformed these industries in a bunch of ways. One of which, sort of the opening shot of digitization, especially in music, was that piracy became possible. And this really, set off a decade or so of terrible reductions in revenue for the suppliers in this industry. But there was a bit of a silver lining, at least from some perspectives, in that digitization also substantially reduced the cost of creating products. And instead of the reduction in revenue choking off supply, which was sort of the fear in 2002, instead what happened was the reductions in cost were huge compared to the reductions in revenue. And there was an explosion of new content creation in music, in books, in movies, in television. That's, by the way, the digital renaissance story, but we'll come back to that later. What that means is that, non-incumbent, independent record labels, not just the major record labels, could compete with the traditional major suppliers if they could find distribution. Now, maybe to the rescue or relevant fact is that you have the emergence of these music streaming platforms, the 2 biggest of which, at least interactively in US and Europe, are Spotify and Apple Music. And they collectively, so first of all, they allow essentially all content. Spotify at this point has 50 or 60 million songs on there. That's just an astronomical number. They're adding something like 5 million per year. So essentially, anybody can get distribution. It's low cost to produce. Anybody can get distribution. So it's a real democratization, at least in principle. But, but it depends on what gets promoted, and we'll get back to that. Let's talk, though, about Spotify and its relationship with its biggest suppliers, the major record labels. In order for a platform to be successful, and there's lots of literature about this in strategy and other fields, in order for a platform to be successful, it has to convince both sides of the market onto the platform. So it had to get the major suppliers, the major record labels, to supply their music, and that required a lot of cajoling and negotiation, because only then would users want to go to a one-stop shopping platform with all the important music on it. So to get the majors onto the platform, Spotify had to offer them ownership stakes. And although all of the negotiation terms are confidential, it's pretty clear from journalistic accounts, and I will show other stuff as we go, that the rates the majors got seem to have been somewhat favorable in ways that maybe will be clear. But there were documented ownership stakes given to them to get them on, as well as advance payments or guarantees of payment. At this point, the majors have become quite profitable. So this is interesting, right? We had 10 years or more of piracy just decimating recorded industry revenue. But then starting, I don't know, about 2010 or so, you see revenue in the left-hand picture here, with the streaming revenue rising substantially. Okay, a real reversal relative to the last sort of 15 years of sad revenue news in the recorded music industry. Now, you can't see firm level stuff for all firms, but we were able to find a few things. On the right-hand side picture, you see the net income for a couple of major record labels, Warner Music and Universal Music. And they had been pretty low for the, the period sort of post-piracy, but you see that they have both become profitable. They've both become profitable in the last 5 years or so, although Spotify remains kind of zero profit-ish. They remain hovering right around zero, although you see it's popped above zero in 2022. Now, so initially, Spotify, which needed major label content, really didn't have a lot of bargaining power. But now I've crossed out dominates in a little cute way. But now Spotify is certainly a big player in music streaming. And it's kind of, you sort of have to be on there if you want to have access to the customer. Because after all, streaming is not just like radio, which was advertising in the US. Streaming is where both promotion occurs and revenue generation, since the rights holders get paid per stream when their music is listened to. Okay, so what seems quite possible, and this paper, by the way, since it had a time range in the title, is going to be the evolution of this relationship and seeming the evolution of payments and bargaining power between this major platform and its upstream suppliers. So they have a complicated relationship. They need each other. Yes, it's complicated. There you go. If you're a Facebook person. So where does Spotify's power come from? And I think there, one of the things we're going to be focused on mainly in this paper is playlists. So a large share of the music listening at Spotify occurs through playlists. What are playlists? These are informative lists of songs, by genre or by type, and people can subscribe to these playlists at no cost and use them. Anyways, these playlists are both utilities for hearing music, but also informative lists. Spotify, as we'll show you, really dominates the playlist on Spotify. Anybody can start a playlist, but as we'll show you, Spotify has come to dominate that playlist space, and it's an important source of kind of steering consumers or users toward listening choices. We have in previous work, Luis and I, shown that the biggest playlists have rather large impacts on the success of the songs that are then added to those playlists. And we'll do some related work today, but for a much wider set of playlists, it's sort of a more comprehensive measurement of this kind of power, the power that the platform has via its choice of including songs on the playlists. So the research question, I guess, for this paper is, can Spotify use its playlists to reduce its costs and improve its bargaining position with its powerful suppliers? If I should really say, though, that might leave the impression there isn't an actual empirical exercise inside this paper. Inside this paper, the heavy lifting empirical exercise, to the extent that there is one, is going to be an attempt to use a lot of data to measure the aggregate impact of Spotify's playlists on the usage that the songs that they choose get. We'll get to that. Okay, so how might Spotify, exercise its power? Well, one thing you might expect to see, and that we'll look at, is would they, add more playlists and take, in some sense, more control over the playlist space on the platform? And in fact, to hint at the results or the facts, yes, we're going to observe large growth in Spotify-operated playlists and the influence of those playlists. Second, what else might they do? Well, it's probably true. Again, it's all confidential, but I think we have pretty strong evidence from industry accounts that there's some lower cost and some higher cost music. Some of the independent label music is lower cost and sometimes contractually so. If Spotify can figure out some really appealing lower cost music, then they could discover that, they could substitute it for more expensive major label music. And that would be both a direct cost saving measure as well as perhaps a source of bargaining power with the majors. And so we're going to observe, we're going to look at the extent to which they promote the less costly stuff versus the more costly stuff, the indie versus the major. And finally, do they use this to negotiate lower royalty rates from suppliers? Here, we're only going to have kind of journalistic accounts and fragmentary things that suggest this might be true. So I want to warn you in advance, that's not going to be the place where we have the most evidence, but we have pretty strong circumstantial evidence. Okay.
Joe, quick question. I know you mentioned it's mostly confidential, but anecdotally, do you know roughly what the cost difference might be?
Well, so what do we know, Luis? Is like we know the average. I mean, we have some. So what's the explicit discount in that program that that Spotify offers? I forget the name of it. The one where you can get played more in exchange for agreeing to a lower royalty rate.
So that's called discovery mode. But I mean, I can't remember the exact numbers, but in terms of royalty payments, it's really hard to have a clear number of the actual difference for different reasons, like secrecy being one of them. But
one thing, and in fact, this slide's relevant in the following sense. So I mean, we're going to claim on this slide that these things that we said, we just articulated some things Spotify might do to kind of get power from the majors. And so we have this really fascinating New Year's letter from the CEO of Universal Music, one of the big three, to his employees. But it was made publicly available. I think it's in Billboard or something. And so the top bullet is just our description of it, but then there's a quote. I mean, Universal Music basically objects to facing competition on streaming platforms from a lot of other music. They're like, there's too much crap out there. We don't have, and they don't say we don't want to compete, but basically that's what it means if there are too many other products in this space. And they're worried that the platforms might substitute lower cost content. And so literally, in his own words, consumers are often guided to generic music that lacks meaningful artistic content and is less expensive for the platform to license. I mean, that's just the standard business person's dislike of competition, I suppose. But it also reflects somehow the cost differences are big enough that he puts this in his New Year's letter to his employees as a reason, that's junk. We don't want people listening to junk. Okay, yeah, there's solution. All right, so
I also have a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, so do you have any idea of the relative market share of the market power of the Apple Music and Spotify? Because depending on the power of the Apple Music, the bargaining power of the Spotify will be totally different, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So I mean, basically, these are the two biggest interactive players in, I think, US and Europe. And my understanding is Spotify is a bit bigger. So Spotify is something like 40% of that market, and Apple's something like 30% of that market. It also, I mean, the thing is that I want to say, especially since we'll talk a little bit about Amazon later, is that, these are clearly big players who have some bargaining power. There's a sense, and I think the labels have this sense that they can't just afford to be off either of these platforms. So it's not as though it's really, I could say, I'm just going to go off the platform and distribute through the other. But it's not as bottlenecky as books are at Amazon. So we'll talk about that maybe at the end. I mean, these are two really big distribution platforms that I think all the record labels understand they have to stay on. But I completely agree with you. I think we both completely agree with you that there's some sense in which they're playing each other against one another. So these are like huge, but not bottlenecks fully, whereas the book story is going to be a little different, maybe. So I agree, but there's not much we can say. It would be, by the way, implicit in your question, be really fascinating to do the same study for Apple if only one could have such data, but that's pretty much impossible. Nobody has those data. So let's talk a little bit a semi-explicit accounting exercise, an explicit accounting exercise about, basically how Spotify in some sense exercises its power. So payments to the majors are really kind of the product of a couple of different things. So the payments generated through Spotify operated playlists are going to be given by this thing that we're going to call alpha, which is the causal impact of basically followers on streams. That's something we're going to measure econometrically. That's the heavy lifting exercise coming a few slides from now. F Spotify, that's a measure of the number of followers, the number of playlist followers on Spotify operated lists. M is going to be the major label share of the songs that are chosen to be on those lists. And then R is going to be the average per stream royalty. Okay, now, and we're going to be able to say something about all these things in green in this paper. So over the next sort of whatever 10 slides, we're going to show you the what we can tell you about alpha and F and M, starting with F and M. They're kind of easier to measure. So in any event, Spotify's power over the majors lies in their ability to increase the influence of their playlists, so the F Spotify, and reduce the use of major label music to reduce the M share, major share on the Spotify lists. So now we have to jump into data so we can be explicit about what we can and can't say. So what do we have as data? We have the top 200 global daily streams on the platform. So between June 2017 and the beginning of 2020, we stopped before the pandemic because music listening became a little strange during the pandemic. And we get that from Spotify charts. So Spotify, you know, as much as we like to complain, we generally in the research community about absence of data from platforms, Spotify is pretty good about making at least the top 200 by day available. So we appreciate that. Thank you, Spotify. Then we have a bunch of playlist data. So here we have, 15,000 most followed playlists. What we, there's if you go from most followed down to least followed, drops off pretty fast. We end up, what we're going to study is the 3,170 most followed frontline, meaning new music lists. Because what you see streaming in the top 200 is new music by and large. So there's no point really in looking at playlists that just feature, Rolling Stones or something. So we're going to look at new music playlists, so-called frontline playlists that I think in the industry refers to music released in the last 18 months by and large. So we're going to have basically for all those playlists, we're going to have by day which songs were on those playlists, and by day how many playlist followers each of those playlists had, so we can construct these measures that we'll be explicit about in a minute. So we're also going to distinguish between three kinds of operators of playlists. So I may not have been clear enough about this yet. On the Spotify platform, anybody can run a playlist. On the Spotify platform, however, many of the playlists are operated or curated by Spotify itself. Others are curated by the major record labels they have these brands called Digster, Filter, and Topsify, which map one-to-one into the major record labels. We're going to call those playlists major record labels. Then we're going to refer to everything else as other. And if you just look kind of at the average share of followers by playlist type, you can see in this lower right-hand side picture that Spotify really dominates the playlist space with 80% of the total kind of playlist followers. Majors and the others collectively are kind of small. Okay, so some more measures. We're going to call SJT the global streaming across the Spotify countries for song J on day T. Then we're going to construct this really important measure for us, capital FJT, which is the sum of the followers on lists with song J on day T. So let's be explicit about this. I find it confusing, so I'm sure I'm being confusing. Like, let's say that on day T, song J is both on the list called Today's Top Hits, which has 25 million followers, and on Viva Latino with 12 million followers, but on no other lists. Then on that day, the song would have 25 plus 12 or 37 million. That's what FJT would be for that. But what we're literally going to do is we're going to do this for 3,170 lists, right? So we're going to aggregate up FJT across many lists. And again, FJT is the sum of the followers of each of the lists that song J is on day T. And we're going to finally distinguish, since a list has a type, we can distinguish these F measures by the overall versus Spotify curated versus major label curated versus other. Okay, so Spotify playlist followers and the treatment of majors. So let's start with focusing on F and M. Again, alpha is the econometric, again, heavy lift compared to other things. So first of all, Spotify, let's see if I can just fix my screen. There we go. Spotify dominates the platform's playlists. I think we already said this just with that 80% number, but if you look over time, it's increasingly true over time that Spotify, measured by the number of followers on their lists, has greater control of playlists. So Spotify goes, that steeply sloping high line is Spotify, and the others are the others. So, as a share, but both overall and as a share, Spotify is coming to exercise greater control over playlists. And again, that's kind of important because playlists are one of the mechanisms by which people are led to music. So this is an important means of control potentially.
Hi, John.
Please.
Can I ask one question regarding the market share of Spotify? So here you are talking about the rising control, but can this rising trend also due to the fact that Spotify can find the product which are most appealing for the consumers?
Oh, I think that's a substantial part of the story, and we'll have some evidence relevant to that in a little bit, or more than a little bit. But so I think that's a really interesting. I mean, when you think about what makes Spotify valuable, I think one of the things that makes Spotify valuable is precisely that they're able to look at 5 million songs and discover the good ones, whereas the traditional model of the recording industry was wise people decided here that this is 100 folks to bet on this year, and 90 of them failed. So Spotify has a better technology, almost surely, of finding good music. And I think that's part of why they can, and I think that's exactly part of why they can do this. So yeah, I agree with you, but we will show you some evidence that maybe will make you scratch your chin a little bit in about 20 minutes. So then this lower picture just again tells you that the shares are high. The shares are kind of stable. It's around 80% Spotify, the share of the playlist by followers. One other thing, though, is if you look at the number of playlists, the number of genres covered by playlists. This is a little bit of eye strain here, but there are genres that just Spotify is in. So playlists, in addition to having songs on them, also have genres associated with them. And what you see over time is that the number of genres covered either by just Spotify or by Spotify as well as somebody else has risen over time. And so no genres that Spotify is not, or very few genres Spotify is not in. So this is just another piece of evidence that they're launching playlists in a bigger variety of genres, which would seem to give them, and you could say this one of two ways, to provide a better user experience to a wider variety of users, but also to perhaps exercise more control over what people are led to on the platform. Again, I don't think we're ready to call this sinister. We're just saying this is what's going on. Okay, one other piece of fascinating paper by Pachali and Datta, which looks precisely at kind of the growth and competition among playlists. Now, if you're a Spotify user, you know that when you log onto Spotify, you see, a home screen, and that screen presents playlists to you. You have to discover playlists. And during 2009, what Pachali and Datta learned is that the extent to which the non-Spotify sponsored playlists even appeared visible to the users dropped from whatever, some number to some zero-ish number. So what it really looks like to us is that Spotify has an intentional playlist strategy in which they're trying to control. Again, control sounds sinister. They're trying to provide a user experience that they curate. Let's say it that way. Okay, so that's F. Spotify has a big share of F of the playlist follower stuff. How about M? M is the major label share of songs on playlists. So again, we can distinguish among three types of playlists. There are the playlists that are operated by majors, playlists operated by Spotify, playlists operated by others. What's probably not surprising is that high stable line shows you that the major label sponsored lists overwhelmingly feature major label songs, and that's stable over time. It's about 80–85%. The middle line is in some sense the important one. That's the major label share of songs on Spotify operated lists. Remember again, Spotify dominates the F measure. And what you see here is that the major label share on Spotify falls from 58 to 45% over this period between 2017 and 2020. So that's kind of a big reduction. Now, it could be a variety of things. Maybe major label music got bad in this, who knows, but we'll get back to that. Or, it could be they discovered better indie stuff. I mean, we're just saying this seems to be a fact. We're not yet saying, we're not giving it a sinister value or anything. Okay, but let's get over to alpha. Alpha then is the impact. So we keep talking about how Spotify dominates F, but F doesn't matter unless F has a causal impact on what people hear. So let's go ahead and try to measure that. So the intuition of how we're going to measure that is following. And it is, we should be clear, it's in principle hard because they don't put random songs on their playlists. They put songs that are popular when they're popular. So we have to worry a bit about, measuring this in a way that's believable. So for example, if we just regress streams on S on F, even with fixed effects, as I'll talk about later, that's going to radically overstate the impact. But we're going to try something a little more careful. What we're going to do is we're going to look at songs before and after big jumps in the number. So remember that FJT measure aggregates the playlist across a bunch of playlists, but it's still true that day to day, there are some big jumps, meaning when you get on, collectively on a couple of big lists in a day or something, there's going to be a jump in F. And the question is there a jump in S surrounding that jump in F? So it's a lot like what we did, Luis and I, with just 4 big playlists a couple of years ago. But again, now we're doing it for essentially all playlists, because we want to know the aggregate amount of power that the platform has. So it's sort of a discontinuity approach where we look at the discontinuous jumps in followers and we ask, is there a discontinuous jump in streams? Now, to do this, we have to define what a jump is. And so we're going to try a bunch of different numbers. Our baseline approach is 250,000 followers, but we'll do it for a whole bunch of other thresholds as well. So we implement this via a regression. And I think what I said probably is clearer than this slide, but we're just going to regress SJT on these dummies, these indicators. But we don't just want, so we want the coefficient alpha to be in a per follower measure, not just the coefficient on a binary variable. So we're going to multiply this indicator for a jump occurring by the size of the jump. Again, so we can have an alpha that's a per follower measure of the impact of followers or of playlists on listening. We'll put in song fixed effects. We'll put age of song fixed effects. We'll put day of the date fixed effects. So try to be very flexible about this. And then what's going to be of interest to us are these alpha taus, which are leads and lags around the jump. So we want to very hands above the table here. Let's just see, does it is it going along? Does it jump up and so forth with an add? Does it going along? Does it jump down with a fall, which would seem to lend credibility to the approach. And indeed, here's what the picture looks like with the 250,000 kind of going along. It's rising, and then it jumps, and then it does what it does. And here's a songs both enter playlists. So there are also big reductions in F on some days when songs are removed from big playlists. And that's what it looks like for falls. So, you might say, well, hey, it's rising, then it jumps. So the way I think what we think is conservative is just to measure the effect as the first fully treated day minus the last fully untreated day. And so that's how we're going to measure the effect. And then we're going to average the jump, the add effect and the drop effect to have just a scalar effect that we can multiply by the follower measure on any given day to say what component of total streams are driven by the playlist inclusion decision. So this table just implements this with 4 different thresholds: 100,000, 250,000, 500,000, 1 million. And what's kind of interesting is that the bottom line number, the impact, is about the same. It's pretty stable, 6.5 to 7. That's per. So what that says is, if we add 1,000 playlist followers, we pick up 6 extra streams for the song per day. Okay, yeah. So that's not a crazy sounding number, and it's stable across these thresholds. So maybe more important than whether it's a crazy number. Now we do a bunch of other robustness, which I'm not going to show you, but I'll tell you about. So we look to see whether there are differential impacts by type of list. And surely there are, in the sense that they have different numbers of followers. But if you do it per follower, we cannot reject that the per follower impact of a major label list and a Spotify list and an other list is the same. So we don't distinguish among them. We let alpha be the same because the data don't want them to be different. We also wondered if alpha varies over time. Now, why might it? Why did we have this concern? I mean, playlists add followers over time. When you follow a playlist, you remain a follower but don't use it. So we wondered maybe the effects would dissipate because the follower measure overstates active followers or something. But when we do this, we get a very stable looking alpha. We let alpha vary by month over 3 years, and there's no trend to it at all. So it seems stable. So it's like a universal constant, like the gravitational. Just kidding. But it's constant across space and time, it seems, or across playlist type and time. There's no space in this model. Another thing we worried about, so we only have the top 200 songs, and we really wish we had more. We'd like to know, what if you had the top 500 songs? Well, we can't go that direction, but we can go the other direction. We can just do the estimates on the top 50 songs or the top 100 songs. And the results are really similar. So that gives us a little bit of comfort that this is generalizable beyond what we can observe. I mean, not total comfort, but more comfort than finding the opposite. The last thing to say is, so we spent, it's always embarrassing in retrospect how much time we spend on everything, right, Luis? But we had thought going in that, probably we could just run fixed effects here. Turns out fixed effects, that is having a song fixed effect, and even pretty flexible time dummies and stuff, you get an enormous effect relative to what you get with this discontinuity approach. So this is just us sort of saying, for the purpose of science, that one doesn't work. And I think it's helpful to look at the pictures. It's not maybe surprising looking at the pictures, because after all, songs are rising before the jump, and then they're falling, around the drop. So I think if one doesn't just look at the sort of discontinuity or period right around the discontinuity, one is liable to overstate impacts.
So Joe, can I just ask a quick clarification question
Please.
on those graphs? Are you literally comparing like the first point that's, I guess, after the blue dashed region to the last point before the blue dashed region?
So I have to be careful. I'm pretty sure what we're doing here is so the -2 is the last fully untreated day. So here's the challenge. There's a day when a song is added to a playlist.
Sure,
But the streaming measure is 24 hours, and to know for sure, given the roundness of the globe, that you have to go to day before versus. So I believe it's +1 versus -2 for the ads. Luis, am I right?
Okay, that's not what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is that, like you say, there seems to be a trend here, right? Yeah. And in some sense, probably you should extrapolate the trend forward. And so, like, you can't, like, I'm confused about you subtracting two things that you literally see in the data versus one thing that you see in the data and one thing that you sort of extrapolate based on a time trend model or something like that.
So I see. What you're thinking is what we should do is run a time trend through the pre-data and then subtract the first fully treated day from where it would have been.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is this really a discontinuity, or is it difference and differences with non-parallel trends?
It's differences. It's differences with a short window.
Right.
It's not differences. You're right. So, but I take your point though. We could be more conservative by letting there be a trend that continues from before. I mean, we're taking maybe over literally the idea of discontinuity, in which case there's no time over which to multiply the trend. But you're right, given the curvature of the Earth and so forth, we have kind of a couple of days. It's not literally a minute-to-minute discontinuity. So, one thing we could do.
But even if you do a discontinuity, you have the trend in there, no? I mean, we can talk about this.
Yeah.
I don't want to derail you.
But if it were really but either way, there's a pretty big jump. If you take your glasses off.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, but you're right. It may be that we're overstating here even a bit as well. That could be. And one thing just to say before I forget, we could. One thing we could do to narrow the window in some sense is to use, rather than the global data, a particular country's data or time zone, a particular, countries with this. But anyways, let's. I'm not sure that would help because of when the day ends and begins at Spotify for the purpose of SJT. But fair point. Fixed effects overstates. And maybe we overstate a little too. Who knows? but not the whole thing. So how much power? The playlist-induced share of streams, how large is the effect? So, I mean, the way we want to measure this is by multiplying alpha by FJT and dividing it by SJT. So the question is, for this song, we observed the streams. What share of these streams were induced by the platform's inclusion decisions? And so that's the measure we want to come to. And here's what it looks like. It looks like it goes from 12% in 2017 up to about 16%, then it drops a bit in 2020. But that's about something like a sixth of the streams that we observe for these top 200 songs are causally induced by these general playlists. And something I haven't emphasized enough is that this is only one of many ways Spotify influences listening choices, right? They have personalized playlists and other stuff. So this is just one of the mechanisms by which they do it. So if this is roughly right, this isn't the totality of their influence on what people hear. It's just one mechanism, the one to many general the playlists, that is the ones that are the same for all users. Okay, so we can take that that overall 12 to 16% number and say, well, how much of it is each of the different playlist operators? And about, so 11, whatever it is, 10 to 13% of it, or percentage points of the 16-ish is Spotify itself, and the others are, much smaller shares. So Spotify has a big chunk of this. Spotify in the playlists it itself controls has a big chunk of this influence on what succeeds, what gets listened to. Now, one thought, that occurred to us, maybe this is just because major label music happens to be getting bad over this time period. I mean, it always comes and goes, right? So, so we found data on terrestrial radio airplay, and we found some data on the Billboard 200, which is an album chart in the US. And if you look at the major label share on these measures, and they have some fragmentary nature to them, some of them, but they're pretty constant. It's not declining. So now that could be consistent with a lot of things. It could be that the records, both kind of record distribution, which is a dying thing, as well as traditional radio, maybe that's somehow more causally related to the majors. So this doesn't prove that major label songs stayed as good. And even if it did say that they stayed as good, it still could be that Spotify has a technology for discovering really appealing indie music that somehow escapes the attention of these guys. But I don't think the answer is that this happens because major labels had a really bad couple of years between 17 and 20. I mean, in terms of the quality of the music that they released. Okay, so the majors on Spotify. So we can take our little accounting identity and use it. Like the change in payments due to this decline in Spotify's, the share of major label music Spotify chooses to employ is just, alpha times F times delta M now, which is 58 down to 45 times R. We don't really know R, but journalistic accounts have it about $4 per 1,000 streams. But we know the other stuff. And so this change in payments is on the order of $42 million during 2019. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we should make of this. In some sense, this is sort of hands above the table stuff, but maybe it's interesting to think about what it means. So Spotify cares about reducing royalty payments to majors today, and they also presumably care about future negotiations. I mean, the vast majority of their cost of doing business is the royalty payments they pay to their upstream suppliers, and so those negotiations are super important. So, what are they doing? I mean, they're doing a couple things. They have this discovery mode, which allows artists to get played more in exchange for lower royalty rates, which almost seems directly like introducing competition into the platform. The majors look, I think, deeply askance at this, and even so the big indies are kind of like, what? But there are some artists who are willing to do this, which is again a suggestion to kind of introducing a competitive like mechanism into the platform. I think just in general. So, I mean, we don't want to overstate what we can really say, but what is clearly true, if you take the suggestion that indie music is cheaper than major music, and again, Lucian Grange claims it's true, and he should know, then the fact that Spotify is reducing the M share does seem either a direct attempt to save costs, maybe again because of discovering better music, or some sort of demonstration that it's possible, which might give the majors a reason to negotiate a little differently next time they have to. So I don't know. This is speculation, and it's sort of managerial speculation. There's a whole different perspective. I mentioned at the outset, we haven't forgotten that we're economists. And so a lot of this paper is sort of from the perspective of the upstream suppliers. And usually as economists, we kind of don't care. We're more concerned about consumers. Or just the functioning of the market generally. So on the one hand, I think we think this means that the downstream platform poses a challenge to the upstream suppliers, but the policy perspective on all this may be pretty different. So if you think there's an upstream oligopoly and they were somehow making it hard for new music to appear, and now here you have Spotify, and they have 60 million songs, and they let everybody on the platform, and they discover good stuff that would otherwise not have been discovered. Oh, well, that kind of sounds like something I might have called a digital renaissance. And Luis and I have both done a bunch of work on this, and so we haven't forgotten that other work that we've done. So we're not ready to say this is bad. It's just challenging for its upstream suppliers and interesting for all of the rest of us. So I think we're probably going to have a little time for Amazon, which is great. How are we doing on time right now? Well, I'll check. Oh, we're doing fine. I looked at my watch. It's the same hour here as it is there. So what have we provided? Evidence that Spotify uses its editorial playlists to steer usage and revenue away from their powerful major label suppliers. We see a big increase in the number of Spotify operated playlists and their followers. So they're kind of trying to control the playlist space. Again, curation for their users. We see a reduction in Spotify's promotion of major label songs. And we see a significant effect on streams. Inclusion, drove 16% of the observed streams in 2020, up from 12% in 17. And, again, even with the trends taken out, I still think it's going to be real similar kind of numbers, similar biggish numbers. Now, Spotify's move away from majors can be seen as a cost-saving measure in the short run, and maybe an attempt to make more favorable negotiation positions in the longer run. Okay. So that's that story. Is it okay? Can we talk a little bit about Amazon? So some very similar issues at Amazon, but it's different. So this is joint with Luis, just Luis. And so here, context is largely similar. I mean, the regulators and practitioners, especially suppliers, are really concerned about growing platform power. Amazon is pretty big now, $500 billion in revenue. Now, only half of that's retail revenue, I guess. But that's not so important as is the fact that a certain product categories, Amazon has a really big share of the overall market. Like we had this interesting conversation 15, 20 minutes ago about, well, what share is Spotify? And it's a good question because after all, there's music revenue generated on interactive platforms, non-interactive platforms, live music, and a bunch of other contexts. And so it's sort of the total revenue generation in music. Spotify is probably a quarter. I don't even know if it's that, but whatever. It's still big enough that they care. But look here, books and ebooks in the US anyways, they're really striking exceptions. Amazon has half of the physical book market in the US and 2/3, although again, nobody really knows the number, but 2/3 seems to be the consensus number. I've heard bigger numbers, but 2/3 I hear a lot. 2/3 of the entire product market goes through this one platform. And so here's, if you thought that there were concerns about downstream, upstream relations in music, I mean, here it's kind of bigger. So you could be provocative and say, what happens to platform supplier relations in a context where the platform becomes a bottleneck? And I hear, again, that's them's fighting words, so maybe I should cross it out and says, become a really big distribution partner. Okay. So two broad parts to what we want to tease you with today. One is just to characterize Amazon's growing power with respect to its suppliers in this industry, who are the publishers. And so we can show you growing market share. Those are pretty well known facts. And also there are a lot of publisher concerns groaning and stuff in the press and disputes, which we can just mention today. And then detailed evidence of the causal impact of Amazon's book promotion on sales. So we had this light bulb moment where we realized, well, Amazon doesn't have playlists, but it does promote its products. It has product pages where it chooses to promote a very small subset of the 10 million books it has for sale. And so that's very much like playlists. And we'll show you Amazon has power. That won't surprise you, I don't think, or maybe it will. But then we want to talk a little bit about how Amazon is using its power over time. And here we have not 4 years, but in some sense, we have 13 years of data on Amazon's promotion decisions. So just again to preview the preview, the folks who study platforms think about a couple of things a lot. They think, well, how do you treat your suppliers? Are you nice to them to keep them on the platform, or do you beat them up and do you launch competing products? And indeed, Amazon has launched a publishing arm, so they've launched a competing product, and we're going to show you that they've really tempered their use of promotion. They used to mainly promote the big five books, and that's changed a lot. So let's show you some stuff. What would we expect from a bottleneck? These are schematic slides, not really the detailed thing. We might expect a bottleneck, a powerful guy, to go ahead and enter, to heck with it. Let's just enter the supplier's market. We might expect reduced promotion of the upstream supplier's products. Whereas early in the game, you need them on the platform, so you might behave rather differently. Okay, so for this, we put together 3 data sets. One is we have books promoted on the Amazon main book page and main ebook page for 13 years, 2010 to 2012, almost every day. Not every day, but almost every day we can see that. So it turns out there are an average of 64 books per day on the book page and an average of 177 books per day on the ebook page. We can link those with the identity of the publisher, whether it's a big five or whether it's Amazon Publishing. And just to be clear, there are two kinds of Amazon Publishing. One is Kindle Unlimited, self-published books on Amazon. But the thing we're calling Amazon Publishing is something else. It's Amazon's publishing arm, where they often republish self-published books, but they are a publisher themselves now with something like 16 different publishing imprints. They've become a publisher, not just a self-publisher. Then we're also going to have daily edition level Amazon sales data for physical and electronic books, not for the whole 13 years, but for 4 years, 2018 to 2021. These are from a vendor called Bookstat, who reverse engineers sales data from sales ranks. So it's estimates of data, I guess, to be fair. And then we're also going to see the release of new editions by year. So that'll help us see the volume of Amazon entry into publishing. And we also have the Bookstat metadata that allows us to know for each Amazon standard identification number, ASIN, who's the publisher and stuff like that. When was it published? All that kind of stuff. So what do these book pages look like? Here's a book page from 2018. You just see it has, I actually couldn't reproduce the whole thing. On average, these have 60 some books on them, but they're just a bunch of books listed here under some headings. And, everybody, I think, knows in marketing and so forth that it matters where you are on the page. Being higher up tends to be better than being lower down. But there also are these different categories that are being promoted, and it's not the same layout every day, not the same, but it's sort of roughly like this. And there's a Kindle page that looks like this too, ebook page. Or doesn't look like this, but it looks something like this. So does Amazon, so part one, does Amazon have power in the book market? Well, so it's a little hard to get these data, but I think this is true. So if you ask the question, what share of sales go through Amazon by product category, you get for ebooks, a number I already said, 2/3. For physical books, a number I already said, about a half. And then when you find other categories, even categories in which Amazon is said to be big, 20, electronics and appliances, 20, that's big. It's a lot. 24.5% is a lot, but I guess 50 is bigger. It's like, thank you for smoking. No, cigarettes kill way more people than your industry. But anyways, yeah, so those are all big numbers, but I think books are in a class by themselves. So if we were interested in like, what would happen if some platform really got a big share of a market, this is a good place to look, I think. So what's direct evidence of power? I mentioned these Amazon main book pages and main Kindle pages. And so now, just again, Amazon, just like Spotify has many ways to promote products, Amazon has many ways to promote products. Only one of which is these pages that present books to people. But they also have personalized recommendations of various sorts. So this is just one subset of the stuff Amazon is doing to promote. So whatever we find in this context should be understood as a subset of whatever power they have to determine stuff. So how large are the effects of these promotional decisions? So here are some pictures are better than regressions. If you run so think about having a measure on this day, is this book on the page? Okay. And so you have a bunch of dates. You have the whole year of data for this book. And then some days this book is on the page. If you run that regression, you get 500 extra sales on average for the physical book page, 152 extra sales for the ebook page. Now, remember, there are 3 times as many books on the ebook page. So it's probably because a lot of them on average are low down the page. So the fact that one's bigger than the other doesn't seem strange to me. But so far, you shouldn't be convinced. Now you should maybe start to be a little bit convinced. If you do the timing stuff and ask, well, does it happen before it makes it on the page or after? And it seems to be there's a big jump when it gets on the page. Now, these, by the way, aren't new books. So it's not like with Spotify where stuff's rising and gets put on playlists. The books being promoted, many, not all, many of the books on the page are not newish. They're oldish, but actually relatively popular, historically books that get then promoted on the page. So it does look like the effects happen when they happen as opposed to before they happen. So maybe looks like it's the pages that are doing it. Moreover, if you divide the page up into sort of the top of the page versus bottom of the page, much bigger effects at the top of the page than the bottom of the page. So I kind of think these effects we're documenting are what we say that they are. Subject to whatever, but that seems to be true. Now, what share? So this isn't quite what share of the promoted book sales during the year that they're promoted are driven just entirely by this promotion coefficient times the fact that you're on the page, And so again, this is not share of all book sales. This is just share of the promoted books. So the books that we see promoted anytime during the year. But these are numbers like on the left-hand side for physical books, an average of about a quarter of the sales of these books during the year are driven by the promotion page. And again, to be clear, it's not the sales of all books, it's the sales of the promoted books. On the right-hand side for ebooks, it's more like 15 to 20%. But again, these are non-trivial shares of sales. So I think this together with their share of the user market tell us, yeah, Amazon seems to have some power in this relationship. And how does Amazon use its power? So one thing they do is they enter into publishing. All right. And so what this is just the number of new ebook titles released by year. So that's kind of good to just do ebooks because we're not going to double count the ebook and the physical book edition, for the majors, although it's a little bit skewed in the sense that Amazon Publishing is by and large in the ebook business. They're not really in the physical book business, although they do sell physical books, but they're sort of trivial in that market. Anyways, yeah, the total number published is small compared to the big five, but it's actually kind of a big number. We're talking about thousands of titles being published. So this, again, deep question in the platform literature. Should platform compete with its suppliers? Well, in this context, the answer seems to be yes. And I mean, normally the idea is maybe not, because they'll go elsewhere and take their toys. Here, I'm not sure they can take their toys. So I think there's a great deal of capacity for the platform to do what would be perceived as rather aggressive in many contexts. Where does Amazon enter by genre? So these bars, there's less information than I wish in this picture. All we're really going to say here, look at romance. 12% of Amazon publishing titles are in romance, whereas in Big Five, it's 3%. And mystery thriller, 11% of Amazon's titles are in that one versus 3%, and literature and fiction. So the ones where the Amazon bar is higher, just as they're relatively big in those aspects of fiction compared to other categories. I mean, compared to the Big Five guys. So how does Amazon exercise its promotional power? Well, in 2010, most of the observed promotion, meaning think about these ebook and book pages, ask yourself what fraction of the books being promoted on that page were from the Big Five? And it's a big number versus what fraction were from Amazon Publishing, which was a small number. And so what happens over time? Well, here it is for the ebook page. The dashed line is the Big Five. So it was over 60% Big Five in 2010, falls down to like 30%. Amazon Publishing was like, 10%, and it rises up to like 50%. There's fluctuations, but it rises a lot. Now, again, so we want to be a little careful. I mean, this is in some sense, whoa, but in some sense, I mean, hey, at Walgreens, they sell Walgreens brand stuff, is that a problem? And I'm not sure. I mean, we might say maybe it's a little different when you have 2/3 of the market. But anyways, I mean, I think there are other stories to tell, and we'll tell one of them in a minute, but it is interesting. The physical book page looks a little like this, but interestingly, Amazon started promoting its own books on the physical book page and then pulled back after 2019. So they got up to like 20% of their promotion being their own books on the physical page, but then they pulled back substantially on the physical page, which I don't really know why, but I could guess. One way I could guess is if you ask the question, what fraction of sales? So Amazon gets Amazon Publishing has 9% of Amazon's sales of ebooks. That's a big share, right? Amazon Publishing has 0% sales of physical books. So I think maybe this is a market they want to play in, whereas they're not going to really be a physical bookseller. And I should also add a major asterisk to this claim, the 9% claim. These quantity numbers are inferred from sales ranks. I'm pretty sure sales ranks at Amazon also include borrows from Kindle Unlimited. So this is not quite per unit sales, I don't think. It is usage, but it's not quite per unit sales. So
excuse me.
Yeah.
May I make a suggestion, a question? Basically, I think maybe it's because time is coming up, right? So yeah. Maybe it's actually useful to discuss it a little bit. What's the meaning of this research? What's the takeaway on this? Maybe let's discuss a little bit. I think we get the sense of the key thing, if it's similar. And my suggestion is this: can you use maybe perhaps 1 minute to talk about what you think is the major takeaway from the two studies, why you do this, what's the meaning. Then I have several comments after that.
Sounds great. Perfect timing. So my next two slides just quickly say, well, how do we think about this? So, and it's really similar to the takeaway from the Spotify thing. Clearly, there's a managerial challenge. So, you know, if you think about people who worry about how managers need to deal with other firms, you know, there's an interesting difference between what's happened, for example, in books and what's happening in video. Right, this and that's arguably an interesting managerial challenge. So I won't dwell on that more, except to say there's that. But on the social welfare side, I think this is very mixed. On the one hand, it's pretty clear Amazon is very powerful with respect to its suppliers. On the other hand, Amazon is the mechanism by which millions of authors of books that would otherwise not be discovered are being discovered and making their ways to consumers. So we are really reluctant. We're not condemning Amazon in this research. There is power, but maybe this is the power that's used for good to deliver the digital renaissance. So we're going to report and let you decide. It's really our takeaway from both these. I mean, but we're not naive. Right now, there's an enormous antitrust policy discussion happening around the world. And there's a lot of concern both about consumers and about suppliers. And I think there's an enormous absence of evidence. I don't see much evidence. I see a lot of outraged comments on Twitter, but I don't see a lot of evidence. So here's some evidence. It doesn't give you the whole answer, but it gives some answers to some of the questions. So it's not a totally satisfactory answer to your great question, but that's our answer. So there we are. And basically, I could stop now and we can talk about whatever.
Cool. So may I make some comment?
Please.
Yeah. So I think while I was listening, I was trying to think about what's the key takeaway. Actually, from guys, in practice, what you are trying to discover here is very similar. It's very familiar. I would say it's very common for digitization, and the key is what's the takeaway here. So I'm going to come up with something a little bit different. So basically, or let me put it this way: even from my listening to you, I think you probably can motivate a little bit clearer. Exactly what are we getting out of this? Is that a strategy thing? Is it management stuff, or is it market power or stuff economics? So I think that this is my take on this. While I was listening to this, firstly, I think the general thing here for me is what digitization means for business or for industry. I think it's the general thing here. Now. And I think you touch upon all those little the different aspects of this. Obviously, really, and one drive for the platform is really as it needs to get big. It needs to have the economy of scale, some kind of network effect to make it useful. And so that's why Spotify, Amazon, any of them, they need to get big. Really to acquire big number of the customers. So they're good for the customers. So that's my first point. Then I think they need to somehow change the supply structure a little bit. And especially they would be good partners with new suppliers. And that we can see from the let's say Amazon with the like the long tail books, or the music, So or for think about the Alibaba, our Taobao. We started with the SMEs, and because it's very hard. Let me put it this way: if you are only relying on the big suppliers, right now. There's very little value added to the customers. It's because the structure of the supply is fixed. So really, I think the path is you're going to get big to some degree. You are going to incorporate new supplies. You are going to change the supply-demand relation a little bit, or a big a big part of it. And as you clearly showed us with the Spotify's example. So I think that's what happens. Let's say call this the creative destruction, and it has to change the supply somehow. And this in general is good to the customers, to the supply side, to some extent is a shock, but it's different degree for different industries. So those are some of the things when I was listening to you, I'm trying to reconcile with myself. And also in certain industries, like the books, like the music, you have to work with the current major suppliers because they have a store. They basically have a stock of the old items. They don't go away. That's like the classics. And unlike, for example, for Alibaba, we sell the new stuff, and it doesn't really need to be the old ones. So it's a little bit different. I think different industries are different. And I think finally the part I want to comment slightly. So it's how do you think what is a platform? Can platform sell its own stuff? I think it's it's just like when big companies coming up, we are amazed by the scale of this thing. But I think it's more a measure. It's to a large extent of measure of the corporation with the how many partners, whatever you play with, and it's inevitable that for the platforms you see the scale is much bigger. I think this is the way to go. But the question here is that good or bad for the society? Now, I think the key is just like the companies, as you mentioned, for the ordering or other stuff. It's never a foul actually to work with suppliers and produce something for yourself. I think the key is to define. It's not as much as the market power. It's more like what you do. When you define what is fair and what is foul. And finally, I think an interesting question can look into this is whether it's making money out of this. Let's say you do it by yourself. Is it because of profitability or something else? My experience with the digitization industry is that it's not really meant to make money. And as we know, Amazon doesn't really make much money at all for e-commerce.
Well, wait a minute. They made 30 billion this. That was true 2 years ago, but that's not true anymore.
No, it's
not just AWS, but whatever. I'm a little confused about where you're going. Are you from Alibaba? Can I have some data? I mean, do you want to put your money where the mouth is? I mean, I'd be happy to study your company too.
Yeah. So my point here is that if you look at Amazon's balance sheet, the majority of its income is from its cloud. And
no, that was true. That was true a couple of years ago. I think now it's a retail is actually finally profitable, was my understanding. You're right that I think for a long time AWS was carrying the company. I'm not sure that's true anymore.
I'm just trying to be useful from a practitioner's point of view to provide some of the feedbacks. Basically, I think we need to think about the
So let me ask: Are you on the operations side of the company? Are you from Alibaba or are you a researcher?
I'm both a researcher and I'm from Alibaba. Yes.
Okay. And do you make your data available to researchers? Do people study Alibaba? I'm sure it's fascinating.
It is possible because we do work with different scholars. Yes.
Yeah. So, do you know the commercial impact of your pages?
What?
Do you know the causal impact of what you choose to promote on sales? Do you bargain over that with your suppliers?
Yeah. So I think it's very, as I said, whatever you do is very normal practice and it's fair practice. It's just what exactly is the question you're trying to address? I think I'm trying to ask this. That's why that's my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, one question is how much power do these platforms have over which products succeed? That's a narrow question that I think we can answer very precisely. There's a much harder question about whether that power exercised by, let's call them dominant, but at least powerful platforms, whether that on balance is harmful or beneficial to society. It's clearly challenging for their suppliers. It's less clear that it's bad for society. In fact, it might be an agent of positive change for society. So that's, I think, if I was unclear, that's the answer.
Yeah. You are clear. That's I agree with you. So I'm not saying basically I concur with your findings. I think make a lot of sense. My point is to how do we interpret that things, and I agree with you. So basically, going back to economics. So how do we measure, is this good or bad, right? So that's anyway. So I agree.
No, that's the next paper. That's a different paper. I'm with you though. I mean, there are ways to think about the exercise of power as a welfare enhancing activity, but there are ways to think about it differently as well. So I think you're right. There are lots more questions to answer. I do think we're at a moment in history though when regulators are about to make decisions almost without any evidence. So
yeah. That's exactly the time I'm spending some time trying to kind of discuss a little bit with you. So I agree with you. So we need to think about the evidence exactly, or the impact, stuff like that.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. Yeah, agreed. Thank you very much.
I appreciate your paper.
Thank you very much. We've had a lot of fun.